Well, I'm delighted to welcome Neill Wilkins to the Scotland Against Modern Slavery podcast. I've had a number of interactions with Neill over the last couple of months, and he's intrigued me with his role and what he does and his knowledge. So Neill is the head of the Migrant Workers Programme for the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Now, that's a job title and a half, Neill. So can you tell me, what is it you do? Tell me about your organisation.
So first of all, the Institute, we're a civil society organisation. We operate across all countries and all sectors, and we pretty much do what it says on the tin. We try to get business to use a human rights lens to view their activities, and to make sure that where human rights challenges arise, that they're effectively and properly addressed. And to do this, we work with business, with civil society organisations, and with governments around the world. The Migrant Workers Programme is one of the most established programmes within the Institute, and we are interested in migrant workers. And there's 169 million migrant workers in the world. That's 5% of the global workforce is a migrant worker. And those workers are employed in all countries and in all sectors. But of course, they are also often the most challenged of workers.
That's such a quite a moving statistic, actually, when you talk about it. 5% of all workers.
1 in every 20 workers is a migrant worker.
That's it's a hugely interesting fact, but actually, it does make sense, and it's topical. Also, Neill, so tell me, what drives you? Because it's a broad topic. You've got to have, I've found in this journey that I'm on, just here in Scotland, a small country like Scotland, I've met so many people that are so passionate, but what they have is driving them inside. Neill, you don't just do this for a paycheck by the sounds of things. Neill, what is it? Tell me what drives you in this role?
I think that most people who work in this area are keen to effect change, and people in this area actually come from all different walks of life and background. I started very late. I was a former forestry worker. I used to cut down trees for a living, but had a career change midway. But other people get into it because they're working within the supply chains of companies, and they start noticing things. They start noticing how workers are being treated, about things that they feel are wrong, or often about things that they feel could be done better. And then they start to develop an interest in the subject, and that's the way that many people would arrive working in human rights organisations or within the human rights departments or sustainability departments of business.
Do you know what? That rings true with me, because the only reason I'm doing, have this involvement with Scotland Against Modern Slavery is because I could see there was something missing in business in Scotland generally about raising awareness, and it kind of led me to where I am now. So I exactly see what you're talking about. But first, from trees to working and protecting the rights of migrant workers globally, that's a journey and a half, Neill.
It certainly is. I mean, I was fortunate. I started off at the Body Shop International as part of the campaigns team there. That was my first job in human rights, and we worked on loads of human rights and environmental issues when I was there. And I was fortunate to be working alongside people like Anita and Gordon Roddick, of course, which was a great introduction to this world.
Interesting, because they have a manufacturing plant that they set up in Glasgow in an area they selected purely because it was an area of high level of social deprivation. The area help the area economically develop. So that's an interesting connection. That's another conversation for another time, Neill. So there you go.
Okay.
I suppose, Neill, as we move on here, then I've read and listened about the United Nations involvement, and they have some guidance about businesses and how globally they should run. So could you talk us through what that is, Neill?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no end of United Nations conventions and things like that that's designed to protect workers and protect businesses around the world. But the key framework that most people would use would be the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. This was developed by the Professor John Ruggie, who unfortunately died this year, but him and his team spent nearly 2 years developing the guiding principles, and they're based on 3 quite clear and simple pillars. The first is that there's always a business responsibility to respect human rights. You know, business must pay attention to human rights in all of their sort of operations, and they have a responsibility for that respect. There's also a responsibility on government to protect human rights, and perhaps we can go on and talk about this a little bit more in a minute, because this is very important. Governments are charged with setting appropriate legislation, but then more importantly enforcing that legislation as well, making sure that it's fit for purpose and that everyone is operating to the same set of rules. And then finally, for workers, there always needs to be the opportunity of access to remedy for grievances, because things inevitably go wrong, and workers must always be able to go through some form of grievance mechanism to ensure that they can be reimbursed for things that might have happened to them.
Interesting about you talk about the access to remedy. That's another point we'll talk about. So I suppose those 3 parts are quite clear. And I think, you know, if I talk about, you know, when you talk about global migration, Neill, it's something in my day job in business and recruitment that I see changing with regards to the questions I get asked. Businesses are asking me or my colleagues, you know, can we get people globally? Can we get them come to work? And as we go through, you know, a labour shortage like we've never seen before, you know, since Brexit, and I suppose I'll give you an example, Neill, and it's a real life example, and it scared the living daylights out of me. You know, we'd been approached by a customer who'd said they'd been sent an email by somebody in Nepal who purported to have, you know, loads and loads of workers, you know, in their hundreds in Nepal that were legal, ready to go and wanted to work in factories all across Scotland, and just to get in touch. And it was a Gmail address. There was no, you know, no real way of seeing this as a legitimate company. But that business said, how do we get these people here, Shan? And to me, I know that these emails, we get them in work, you know, people are exploiting, or sorry, there's unorthodox ways of exploiting people, I suppose, globally, and they're suggesting that they can get labour to us. And I know that there will be those businesses go, right, okay, send them over. What do we need to do? And that scares me, Neill. So can you tell me what's your thoughts on that, the global?
No, exactly. And I think that this is a consequence of Brexit in many ways, and it's something that will impact on many companies operating here in Great Britain, right the way across the country. That we will be looking elsewhere for migrant workers to come and fulfill these low wage, sometimes low skilled positions. And as you say, there's already a shortage of workers to fill these roles. And as we look further afield, it becomes harder and harder to undertake the effective due diligence that companies need to be undertaking on those recruitment agencies and employment agencies who will be doing exactly what you've just talked about, Shan, sending emails, trying to secure jobs for workers. But how will any company in Scotland, in the rest of Great Britain, know the conditions under which those workers are being recruited back in their home countries? It's very, very likely that those workers have been told a pack of lies about the jobs that might await them, about their pay and conditions. about their working and living accommodation. It's quite likely that they will have been promised some form of green card. You know, if you work for long enough, you'll maybe be allowed to stay, then your family can go over, all the rest of those things. But the main concern is that those workers will be charged large recruitment fees to secure that job. So this is already very common practice, primarily in the global south, where workers will pay $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to secure employment abroad. And if you come from a country where you're likely to only earn that sort of amount, if you're lucky, in a year or 2 years, you can see how large these sums are. So workers will be being charged even larger sums to come to Britain to work, because the jobs potentially will be better, and all sorts of promises will be held out, and the workers will be told, don't worry about the cost, because you know you'll be able to pay that within a few months of your paychecks going in. And of course we know that that won't necessarily happen to them. This is a scam that's perpetrated on migrant workers right the way across the world.
And you know, that's something that's very close to home for me, I suppose. It's, you know, I read about these types of things happening in the Middle East. You know, we read the press about what's going on with the construction for the World Cup and some of the stories associated with that. And then, you know, given what you said, and you know, the example I've just given about that Nepalese example, is that it could be happening much closer to home. This isn't it, just the World Cup.
It absolutely can. We tend to only think of modern slavery at its most extreme edges, and when we think of things like modern slavery, we do tend to think of chains and incarceration, all of those worst manifestations of what slavery might be. But the reality is, and then maybe we'd be better off calling it forced labor, because the reality is it's a continuum of exploitation. It's seldom a point fixed in time, but a sort of continuum of labor exploitation. And many of the things that we would see would class as indicators of forced labor. You know, if a worker is in debt and therefore can't move on, can't say no, then that's one of the indicators of forced labor. And we've recently seen cases where goods, you might have seen it in the newspapers, where goods produced in Malaysia, in particular PPE equipment, rubber gloves for the COVID pandemic, have been stopped from entering markets in the US by the US border patrols because they were deemed to be the products of slavery. And so companies who are using these workers are exposing themselves to not just reputational risk, but financial risk as well. That's before you get on to the ideas about wanting to protect workers, of course.
So, you know, the example you talked about that there with the withhold and release orders, that's a really interesting one. That happened in America, as you mentioned there, isn't it? And that was the legislation driven by the US government, and it was actually stopping goods entering the country that potentially have had the hands of people who have been exploited that help manufacture them. Is that the way I've described that?
No, that's exactly what has happened. And you know, civil society activists have been very quick to pick up on this and realize that this is a way of advancing measures to prevent modern slavery. But even in this country, Shan, of course, we've seen what happened in the clothing industry in Leicester, where companies like Boohoo and Pretty Little Things and others all faced widespread sort of censure in the press about the working and living conditions of workers in their supply chains here in England. And that absolutely is a fate that will definitely befall companies if they don't undertake effective due diligence on where these workers are going to be coming from. You can just see the newspaper headlines. And the other thing just connected to that is no company should think that they can escape because it's not them who are employing that worker. It might be somewhere down in their supply chain, or it might be a worker employed via an employment or recruitment agency. But don't think for 1 minute that the press will stop at that recruitment agency. They will chase that up until they find the brand. And so it will be the name of a company is employing these workers under those conditions. And that's the serious reputational risk for companies.
And I think you're right. The reputational damage, there's a human misery that this causes globally, but it's also as from a business, that's the huge reputational risk they have. And I've, been quite strong in some of the issues that some of the process that some recruitment agencies may have used in the past or currently use. There's, in the press 6 months ago about many umbrella companies and agencies not paying employers national insurance, but charging their customer. And my stance on that is if a business is using a recruitment agency and they don't know that they're using these schemes, why do they not know? Why are they not checking? Why are they asking to see pay slips and auditing their supply chain and auditing their suppliers and labour suppliers? But if an agency is willing to go that far to scrape a few more pence of margin and not comply effectively with the national insurance regulations, what other processes do they not have in place that could allow other things like what we're about today happen?
No, absolutely, Chen. And criminality never exists in a vacuum, and I think that this brings us back to the UN Guiding Principles. There's a role for government here. There's a role for business, clearly, that business needs to be paying attention, but there's also a role for government in this space as well, because protecting migrant workers doesn't just protect those workers, and that's the primary consideration, but it also protects law-abiding businesses who are trying to play by the rules. What business wants is a level playing field to operate under. And if one company is sticking to the rules, making sure that their operation is legally compliant, and they can be undercut by somebody who doesn't stick to the rules, is able to supply staff, goods or services at a cheaper rate, then that's not fair, and that doesn't provide that level playing field on which companies can compete fairly and thrive. And so there's a very clear role here for government, and I don't think that we talk about this enough, that it doesn't just protect workers. Proportionate and proper legislation, and more importantly enforcement, because it's often the enforcement piece that is missing, also helps protect law-abiding businesses.
And that's really, really key point about that. In any industry there'll always be businesses that won't play by the rules or cut corners to scrape margin. And I think I think somebody described that to me as in procurement practice about looking at, but I think it's bottom down or bottom up exposure, where they look at if something's too good to be true when it's getting priced. Why? Why? Don't just say yeah, and don't squeeze purely based on price, because it can it'll expose these risks. So I suppose, Neill, we've talked quite a bit about business, the role of business, legislation, the UN principles. I suppose for maybe many of the listeners, and again aimed at the members of SAMS that are Scottish-based businesses, and there's around 40 of them now. Can you tell me, if I was to ask you, if I was in one of these companies, what are the 3 things that a company could do or should do now to move them on quickly, if that makes sense?
The first thing to do is to educate yourself. Make sure that you know where workers who are in your operation are coming from. And that includes workers that you're employing directly, but also extended workforces perhaps supplied by agencies and others. You absolutely need to know everything about those workers, and part of that is through your processes, but part of it is through direct worker engagement as well. You know, talking to your workforce, making sure that you sort of understand, leaning in rather than leaning out. So it's mapping where your workforce are coming from. The second thing is about making sure that you've got very clear processes in place to make sure that you are, for recruitment, to make sure that you're empowering your own hiring managers and those responsible for making decisions about which agencies you're going to be working with, where workers are coming from, what are the checks and balances that are in place. So don't just rely on individual managers to be making local decisions. You know, make sure that you've got very clear laid out processes. And then finally, the third thing, and this brings us back to the UN Guiding Principles once more, is make sure that you have some form of grievance mechanism in place for workers when things go wrong. And you know, things happen, you know, and it's important that workers can feedback, can report back, but also have a vehicle whereby they can seek redress if it turns out that they have been wronged. And that might be through company processes, or it might be through a judicial process. But companies just need to be aware of the need for that grievance process always.
So this kind of the final point was, as you talked about earlier on, the remedy, isn't it? Having that in place, having that area covered off. Many businesses might have like an employee hotline, you know, or those type of things. Would you say that's enough, Neil?
No, I absolutely wouldn't see that as enough. And very often companies think that if they have a hotline, they're going to be getting feedback from workers. And the common thing is we know that everything's all right because we haven't had any complaints through the hotline, you know, but exploitation of workers takes many different forms, and many of these things wouldn't be reported simply through a hotline. The other thing with hotlines is that they raise expectations of workers. Workers would immediately feel that, you know, my grievance will be addressed in some way, but very often, unless there's a process in place to then take that and do something about it, you know, that restitution can't be made. So you need much more than just a hotline to let you know what's happening. You need a clear process that workers could work their way through to seek the restitution that should be part of being employed anywhere.
Okay, well, you've been a huge insight, a huge knowledge base, Neil. And again, part of what we're trying to do here at SAMD is making sure that that knowledge is being shared, but people know where and how to access this knowledge. So, you know, I'm delighted that you agreed to take part, Neil. And so it's been a pleasure. So Neill Wilkins, Head of Migrant Workers Programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, thank you very much for taking part.
Thanks very much, Shan, and very, very pleased to have taken part in the programme. Cheers.
Thanks now.